take you out and go through the Stations of the Cross. I normally do that as a part of every retreat I do. I'll give you a little bit about the history of it before we start. This probably the oldest devotion that we know in our church actually came from the Jews, and it was the idea of making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Jews, as you know, used to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem every Passover. And when the Christians began to grow as a community, the result of it was the Christians, the Jews who'd become Christians, when they went to Jerusalem for the Passover, what they would do is they would visit the sites that were important to the life of Jesus, as well as being there for Passover. And long after the end of the Christians mainly being Jewish, the practice of visiting the sites that were important to Jesus continued historically. And if you study in the Roman Catholic Church, there are three major places of pilgrimage. The first major place is Jerusalem. The second is Rome, and the third is Santiago de Compostela in Spain. But they are the three major places of pilgrimage with regards to indulgences and that sort of thing. The way you used to travel in those days, because obviously they didn't have photos and things like that, but the way you would travel in those days is you'd look up the diary of a person who had been there, and you would see the things that they saw that were important to them, and you would visit them. And so the sites that were important to the life of Jesus ranged from the number about 4 at one time until about 35 at another. And number-wise, according to what was the most popular diary of a particular day. So places became more important or less important. When the Muslims finally took over Jerusalem, the thought of visiting Jerusalem was so important to Catholics that what the Catholic Church did was take all the shrines from the city of Jerusalem and place them in every Catholic church, so that you could go into a Catholic church, any Catholic church, walk around and essentially visit the shrines in Jerusalem and make your pilgrimage to Jerusalem without leaving your parish church. The date on which that happened, the number of stations was 14, which is why we have 14. And so the date. A couple of curiosities. As you look at the stations, people look at stations in all different ways. These are wood carvings from Oberammergau, I would be willing to say. But if you see stations, they're mosaics or anything like that, I'd like you to know the station is actually the wooden cross. The wooden cross is below these. Sometimes it's worked into it. If you see a station that is entirely gold, look very carefully, you'll find a wooden cross somewhere. And the wooden crosses have got to be put up by a Franciscan, because they represent 14 Franciscan churches in the city of Jerusalem. The Franciscans are the one who administer all the churches in Jerusalem. And so the stations began that way as we know them today. Over a period of time, the stations came to have a more and more symbolic thing in the Catholic Church, because the stations were used essentially to teach. And one of the ways they were teaching, they would do that. If you ever want to make the stations, I'll tell you the two things that are necessary to do it. Either one person can walk around while we all make the stations. Oftentimes they do that in a church. The server and the priest will go around. Or you walk around. There's no prayers you need to say either. You can just walk. Once it's finished, you must say a prayer for the intentions of the Holy Father. If you don't pray for the intentions of the Holy Father, you never get an indulgence. If you're interested in indulgences, you cannot receive one. That's why when you say the Rosary, those extra Hail Marys and the cross, those have to be said for the intentions of the Holy Father. That's how you get the indulgence from the Rosary, because the Rosary is the upper part. But those 3 Hail Marys, 1 Gloria, I believe the Creed and the other prayer are specifically for the intentions of the Holy Father. And it actually does not matter what prayers you say. You could pray any prayer you want. It's even just one prayer, but it must be said for the intentions of the Holy Father. Also, if you're into it, you can study certain missionary societies will publish. The Holy Father's intention is public each month. So you know what that prayer is being offered for that month for everyone in the world who prays. Okay? This month it's being offered for missionaries in Kenya. Okay? So anyway, we will go out and make the stations where they are in the yard.
The first station, Jesus is condemned to death. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. What the church wants you to see in this station is a contrast between the power and the authority of Pilate, who represents the Roman government and all this sort of thing, and the fact that Jesus, who stands before him, having been abandoned by the apostles and without support of any kind. And we watch the peace. We mentioned this in one of the talks. The peace that Jesus exercises, he just stands there. And the agitation of Pilate. Pilate will try and get a bribe from the apostles. He will try and placate the high priest. He'll try and do a whole bunch of things. And if you watch very carefully in the text, what Pilate is trying to do is release Jesus. He wants to have an excuse to release him. Obviously, the apostles don't have enough money to make a bribe worthwhile, but a bribe would be an excuse to release him. So he's looking for all these kinds of excuses to release him. And what is Jesus trying to do? What Jesus is trying to do is the will of his Father. Whatever that is, he's about the will of his Father. And the interesting thing, when everything is said and done, for all the authority and everything Pilate has, he cannot do the one thing he wants to do. He's not able to free Jesus. And on the other hand, Jesus, who has no power, no backing, no nothing, he does exactly what he wants, which is exactly what the Father wants. And the great teaching of the station is that freedom in human life isn't found in power and authority. It's found in our relationship to the Father. If I'm in a relationship with the Father, I will accomplish what the Father wants. And if I'm out of a relationship with the Father, I can't even do what I want. The second station, Jesus is made to carry his cross. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. Something to know about the cross is they did not use a cross like we use on our things. Largely, the reason we use this cross, it's a creation of artists, because it's a very neat thing with the sign on top and all this sort of thing. The way the Romans crucified was on a T, and the standing pole, they were all up there on Calvary already, and the only thing you carried was the crossbeam, like a log, and it would be measured according to your size, and they were simply issued as they went off. You normally were tied to the crossbeam in a cross form. It made it difficult for you to walk, and around your neck was hung the sign saying what you did. And the reason for that was they used to believe, incidentally in psychology no one believes this today, but they used to believe that the thought and the sight of being executed prevented other people from committing crimes. And so they used to use execution as a very public thing to stop certain kinds of crimes. It doesn't affect people that way. But anyway, that's what they were about. So they gave Jesus the cross. Whenever you hear Jesus talking about the cross in, in the gospel accounts before the crucifixion, our temptation is to think he's talking about crucifixion, but he isn't. In the Jewish tradition, the cross represents the thing that an ox uses to pull a cart. So there's a cross beam and then something that goes across the two oxen. And that's what they mean by the cross. When Jesus talks about take up your cross and follow me, that's what he's talking about. Because the cross represents what's a part of every human life. And you know that you have to be very, very young as a human being to think there's no cross in any life. Okay? Every life has a cross. And the interesting things about crosses is they are peculiar to individuals. That's why it's oftentimes difficult for us to understand what another person's going through. Like these cross beams, they're to the size of the person, and they have the holes drilled in them for the person who's going to carry it. It is all set up for the person. And the whole thing in human life, it's almost a moment of maturity when you recognize you have a cross. Most people won't even know what your cross is. And if you want to be a successful person in human life, you have to carry that cross. I think a lot of us look at other people's crosses and think, I could do a better job with that cross. Or you look at someone else, you think, I could never lift that cross. But the fact of the matter is you have one ideally cut for you. That's all you need to worry about. That's your cross. The third station, Jesus falls the first time. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. Over the period of history, the stations were put together in an effort to try and teach all the lessons of the Christian life. There are several stations that have no historical basis. There's nothing in the scriptures to represent Jesus ever fell. And that's curious because it's the only station that's repeated. It's repeated 3 times. And as a matter of fact, there's nothing in the scriptures ever to say he fell. Did he fall? He could well have. You know, the tradition is he did. We don't know. But one of the things you normally see stations like this. There's small groups of people. And you see Jesus down and almost the other guy pushing him, holding actually a whip thing that he's been hitting him with. And the whole idea of the cross. The fact of the matter is, Jesus fell because of the crowd. In the Mideast, even to this day, refrigeration is minimal. And if you ever go to anywhere in the Mideast, you will find that people shop for their food twice a day. They shop for the food before the noon meal and before the evening meal. And in the streets of Jerusalem, even to this day, those streets are still there. If you go to the streets of Jerusalem, during the time when people shop for food, you need to know the street you're going on before you know the direction you're going, because traffic moves one way on those streets because it is so packed with people. But if you want to get to someplace over there, you need to go down this street, turn around, and come back to the crowd going the other way. The crowds are intense. While the Romans were in charge of Jerusalem, there was, on average, more than 2 crucifixions a day, every day. And so the people in the crowd had seen so many crucifixions. If you were carrying a cross, you were simply in the way. And so when Jesus was going down, he fell not because anyone was pushing him or anything like that. Jesus fell because he was in the way, and he was tied to this cross, and this whole crowd's moving. And I think the great lesson for you and I to learn in our own lives, you know, when we have problems and difficulties and stuff, it's very easy for us to believe that someone is against us or someone is trying to hurt us. You know, all kinds of things that go on. But we have to understand every person on the face of the earth is about themselves. Hopefully I'm about myself in a relationship to Jesus, and I'm about myself in trying to help people and stuff like that. But ultimately, everyone actually is about themselves, and everyone's carrying a cross. You can't see other people's crosses off, but everyone is carrying a cross. When you and I fall, it is not through the malice of other people. You and I fall through the selfishness of other people. Everyone else is too interested in themselves, and because of that, we run into one another, and we fall. This is a good station to win our hearts. Ask forgiveness of the people who fall because of us, because there are people all over who fall simply because they don't have the ability to stand in the conflict with us carrying our cross. People we don't even know about yet. And it's just, that is the nature of human life. And to just take this as a moment, you know, to ask God to forgive us for the number of people around us who have fallen because of us. The fourth station, Jesus meets his mother. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. This is a station that does not appear in the scriptures. We do know that when Jesus reached Calvary, Mary was there. That's clear in the scriptures. And it would be natural for the family to go along as they were going through the town. But the station itself does not appear in the scriptures. The thing that is really important here is the idea of what we see in this meeting between Jesus and Mary. I don't know if you've ever thought much about this, but when we think about the fact of Jesus dying and Jesus' suffering and all, and we think of Jesus, we know he's an innocent person. He never sinned. But the fact of the matter is Jesus took our sins upon himself. So when you watch Jesus suffering, you're seeing a sinner suffer. It's not his sins he's suffering for, it's ours, but he took them on himself. You know, it's very different with Mary. Mary's a person who never sinned. She did not redeem us, and she did not take our sins on herself. And yet in many ways she had a life of immense suffering, and this being a catastrophic moment. You know, I think one of the lessons of human life, it's always easier to suffer ourselves than to watch someone we love suffer. And the horror of this meeting is not what we would think about people going through. The horror is of what Mary feels watching what happens to Jesus, and the horror of what Jesus must feel knowing what he's done to Mary by allowing this to happen. And this look is that mutual conveying of the victim, of someone's love. And yet on the other hand, when we think of Mary, we think of her as the Queen of Angels, Queen of Heaven and Earth. You can think of there are more titles to Mary than there are people in this crowd. I think you know that. But we think of all these different titles to Mary, and she has all those titles for only one reason, and the fact of Jesus' death, because that's where all grace comes from. So everything that she received, and all her glory and everything, comes from the fact that he was willing to go through this. And I think one of the most difficult lessons of human life is often in doing what God calls us to do, we can deeply hurt people who are very close to us. And we must still do what God calls us to do. Jesus deeply hurt Mary simply doing what God was calling him to do. And on the other hand, I can never do more for any other person than doing what God calls me to do. Jesus served Mary best because he served his Father first. If he had skipped the crucifixion, she didn't go through that, you and I wouldn't even know her name today. The fifth station, Simon of Cyrene is forced to help Jesus carry his cross. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. There's a peculiar aspect to Roman law, and under Roman law, if we were going to execute me, and you were the guards who were guarding me on the way to execution, if for some reason I didn't make execution, let's say I escaped or I died, you would be crucified in my place. So when a guard was required to take care of someone, it was their job to bring the person to what they had been assigned to do. One of the really interesting things in Jesus' story is the amount of beating and the crowning with thorns and the abuse that took place to Jesus the night before. I don't know how many of you visited Jerusalem, but anyway, if you ever visit Jerusalem, in the place where Jesus was scourged, there's an ancient Roman game. The game was well known all over Rome. It's called the Game of the King. And the Game of the King, you had a little doll, and we would roll dice and move figures on a board. And if you hit one of the increments of a king, let's say a crown, you put a crown on the doll. If you hit scepter, you put a scepter on the doll. If you hit this adoration, you had to bow to the doll. But anyway, as soon as the last thing was done to the doll, you won the pot of money, okay? And so that's the way the game was played. That's what we see described in the scriptures about his crowning with thorns, and they put his scepter in his hand and they bowed before him. Jesus wasn't crowned with thorns once. He was crowned over and over and over and over during the night. It's a game, and the Roman soldiers played it. But as a result of that, at this point on the way to Calvary, there suddenly becomes the realization he might not make it. And if he doesn't make it, there's a little group of soldiers who are going to be crucified. So at this point, they decide somebody else has got to take the thing. This may be an argument for the fact that the falls did occur, that the first thing that happened was the fall, and then they realized. So anyway, they take Simon of Cyrene, they just draft him. And you can imagine Simon of Cyrene, he's not even Jewish. He works there as a transient worker, and they grab him out of the crowd. They don't want to offend the Jews. That's why they pick a non-Jew. So they grab him out of the crowd and make him think. And you can imagine Simon picking up the cross thinking, if I'd left work earlier, I wouldn't be here now. If I'd left later, there 1,000 things go through your mind to say, I shouldn't be here now, But I'll tell you something. Do you know when you get to heaven, the very first thing Simon will say to you is, I am the man who carried the cross of Jesus Christ. And what this station tells you is that you have no idea the most important moment in your life. That's why you have to be very careful of every moment. A moment that appears to be nothing to you, or a moment that appears to be horrible, can ultimately, in fact, be the most important moment of your life. This is the only moment we know of his life. The sixth station, Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. This is another station that has no basis in Scripture. I think you all know the shroud. The shroud at the time of the stations, the shroud was in a large square frame folded so the face of Jesus showed over the high altar in the Roman Catholic Church in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, if you ever visit there. And people had no idea about how the shroud looked unfolded or anything, so they made up a legend about how the face of Jesus got on the shroud. And the legend was that while Jesus was on the way to the cross, a woman came up and wiped his face, and the thing ended up on it. And you should be able to know that it's fictitious from the name Veronica. The name Veronica is Vera, which means true, and icon, which means image. Veronica, true image. Okay? So Veronica is a totally fictitious thing they made up about the cloth. But the reason why it was so important is that Veronica, as a result of that, became the patroness of artists, and there was no major church built in the world in that whole period of time for 1,000 years that didn't have a statue of Veronica in it. And the reason is artists would not work in the church unless there was a shrine to Veronica. It became a very popular devotion. If you ever visit St. Peter's Basilica, you know there are 4 major statues facing the altar on the corners, and you would think they'd be the 4 evangelists. One of them is Veronica. The great lesson of Veronica, I think, has to do with the idea of the wiping of a face of Jesus and the image appearing on the cloth. We happen to belong to a religion of immense art, and there are portraits of Jesus in carved wood, they're in carved ivory. I've seen portraits made out of precious stones, I've seen them out of mosaics, I've seen paintings, everything of Jesus, weavings, just magnificent art with Jesus. But we need to remember that ultimately the true image of Jesus, the Veronica, is the image I created Jesus by my life. It is the sweat, the blood, the tears of everyday life. They're the true image of Jesus, not the immense art we have. Jesus falls the second time. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. And again, in the movement of the stations, the significance of this is if the first fall was due to weakness, and then they corrected it by removing the cross, then he falls again. It's an even more serious sign of how bad he is. But at this particular station, it might be a good idea for you and I to take a moment and forgive those people who've been responsible for us falling. And again, oftentimes, they don't really realize what they're doing at all. They are about themselves. That is the whole problem in human life. You and I have very difficult things in the carrying of our own cross, and it really blinds us to the crosses of people around us. The 8th station, Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. In the city of Jerusalem, there was a small organization of wealthy women, and what they used to do was accompany prisoners who went to their death on the cross. And the reason they did that was that in Israel, by law, everyone was executed in Jerusalem. That's why there's so many executions there. But they used Jerusalem as the place of execution. And I don't know how much you know about law, but if you ever study law, one of the peculiarities of law is only poor people get the death penalty. Rich people do not get the death penalty. That's just the way law works. It always has. So what you end up doing is having a lot of these people in Jerusalem who come to Jerusalem to be executed, who don't have any finances or anything. They're poor families, and their family wants to be with them. Well, this organization in Jerusalem would take care of the families of prisoners and take them so that they could be there with the thing. And the Roman emperor was so impressed with what these women did, he gave them a privilege that was nowhere else in the Roman Empire. They had the privilege of bringing drugged wine to the cross. They had to persuade one of the guards to give it. They could not give wine to the prisoner, but they had the privilege of bringing it, so it was there if the guards decided to do it. Okay? I think one of the things to note about this is the way Jesus speaks to them. When they come up to him, he says, "Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves." And what Jesus is trying to get across, it is a peculiarity of being a human being, is that you and I weep more over the consequences of sin than sin. You know, you can have a little kid in your house, and you can tell him 1,000 times not to play baseball in the house. The only time he'll notice it is when he breaks a lamp. And then he'll say, "Oh, I wish I didn't get," this sort of thing. people, the most repentant people in the entire world are people with hangovers. Never occurs to them the night before, okay? But by God, you can get repentant with a hangover, you know? And one of the stupid things about human beings is we are more concerned about effects than causes. And if we were concerned about causes, there would never be effects. You know, like for instance, you and I look at the scenes of the Holocaust, those films, and you and I are horrified by the films. You and I should be horrified looking into the face of Hitler, not those people. That's the effect. And it's something to remind ourselves. What Jesus was saying here is, when you look at the crucifix, you're looking at the effect of sin. Don't look at the effect of sin. Look at yourself. You and I are the cause of sin. If I never sinned, there would never have been a cross. It's flat out. You know, it's not the death that's terrible. It's the sin. If you and I can do away with causes, the effects disappear. The ninth station, Jesus falls the third time. We adore thee, O Christ, and we bless thee. Again, if you visit the city of Jerusalem, this fall and all the rest of the stations take place inside a single building, which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is Jesus' collapsing as they reach the Calvary itself, okay? He collapses when he reaches Calvary. And I think one of the things to really remind ourselves about this station with regards to the falls of Jesus is, you know, Jesus arrives ultimately at glory because he got up as often as he fell. It is one of the fallacies of Protestantism in the United States that Protestantism really pushes innocence as though you're not supposed to have sinned, and that is fallacious. There is no person on the face of the earth who hasn't sinned. The basic teaching of our church is, if you sin 1,000 times and get up 1,000 times, you will see glory. If I sin twice in my life and only get up once, I'm damned. It has nothing to do with how often you fall. It has everything to do with whether or not you and I get up when we fall. And this station reminds us, falls are not significant. What is significant is the rising. The 10th station, Jesus is stripped of his garments. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. I'm always reminded at this station, in our parish, we always enact these. We go around the entire town of Spreckles, and we have several thousand people who come, which are more than our church will hold or that are in our congregation. But the whole congregations from the peninsula, from different denominations, come over for the station. So we have the young people group in the parish act it out. And one year when we acted it out in the rain. It was only the 1 year. And I remember when they took the robes off, you know, the young man who was acting it out. Curiously, his name was Noah. Anyway, in this station we see the removal of the garments. According to the payment of the Roman army, the way an army was paid was, let's say we were marching with the army and we were going to capture Fresno, okay?